Welcome to our first substantive lecture. The institution that we will cover now is contract law. The topics covered in this lecture are first, what are contracts? So let's start with some sort of definition of contracts. We will cover the key elements of contract formation that are offer and acceptance and the intention to be legally bound. We will also cover the sources of contract law, focusing here on sources according to their stringency, classified according to their stringency, and we will focus also on contract validity, on procedural and substantive classifications of the issue of contract validity. What we will leave for later, and that includes a more self-directed study, are discussions in class, and as needed, a clarificatory lecture, are the issues of contract interpretation, breach, and remedies. There are other things in the chapter that are also important, but let's say that I am highlighting for you here the most important topics of the chapter. To give you an idea, consumer law is touched very briefly on the chapter, but consumer law is a bit of its own field. It's not really 100% contract law, so we're not going to give it as much attention as the topics that I have mentioned, which are, let's say, truly the backbone of contract law. All right, so let's begin by asking what are contracts? Contracts are binding agreements between parties. So parties here is a technical term. It means just, let's say, persons. Typically, it means persons. Remember that that does not necessarily mean real persons of flesh and blood. The law can grant personhood to corporations, to clubs, to NGOs. And note that I say that it's between parties, not necessarily between two parties. It can be more than two parties. For example, when I make a corporation, that typically means that you, somebody else, and a lot of other people, and myself, we all pool money together so that we create this entity. And that original contract where we put the money together in this joint, let's call it, that's another thing, but let's call it this joint venture, this joint enterprise, that's a contract. And but most, for our purposes now, just beginning this study of contract, we should just reduce the complexity and say, so contracts are agreements between parties. Typically that would be two, let's say a sale, a buyer and a seller, a rent, a lessor and a lessee. So that's how it goes. Contracts are binding agreements. And what binding means is that, as opposed to other agreements, not doing your part of the bargain, that's called a contract breach. Breaching the contract, not doing the part of the bargain, has consequences in law. When it says binding, binding here means that it's legally binding. And that means that the law attaches consequences to breaking your bargain, breaking your side of the bargain. Of course, unless you're able to somehow get yourself off the hook, which is also a possibility. Now, we just said that a contract is a binding agreement. Let's break down this idea of agreement a little bit. Typically, agreement is the law considers that agreement has two parts, offer and acceptance. So do you want this iPhone at 500 euros? Yes or no? That's the offer. Yes, I want it. That's the acceptance. So offer and acceptance are the two parts, the two components of the agreement element. And of course, you can have an agreement, hence offer and acceptance, without it being binding. So you also have to be able to find this intent to be legally bound, and to be able to distinguish between mere agreements and real contracts, and that's something that we will consider in the next slide. But just now consider this element of offer and acceptance. You need to have these two human actions getting together, joining together, clicking together. In the common law, they call it the meeting of the minds, which is a very sort of poetic way of thinking about this, sort of getting this sort of poetic expression of this offer clicking with the acceptance. Now, offer and acceptance, something interesting about them is that this offer and acceptance is, is actually, sometimes it's quite simple, as in the case. So, hey, do you want this iPhone for 500 euros? Yes. So it's very quite simple, but sometimes offer and acceptance can be very complicated. It can have many steps and even some sort of missteps or failures along the way. So for example, let's say I give you the offer, hey, this iPhone for 500 euros, and then you say, give me some time to think about it. Then after 1 week, you say, yes, I want the iPhone, but by then you have sold it to somebody else for 550. So what went on there? Do we have an offer and an acceptance, and then it's my fault not having the iPhone anymore? Or do we have an offer that got rejected or got withdrawn and then was offered to somebody else? Or do we rather have some different sort of situation that instead of really being an offer, I had merely an invitation to negotiate? That was probably not true, but then that's this dynamic of offer and acceptance is something that is explained in the book. This is just to give you a general idea of how of what this is all about, because offer and acceptance can be very fast, very immediate, very transparent, but it can also be some sort of very protracted dynamic. At the limit, of course, there's even a chance for misbehavior here. Now, I can, for example, interact with you in bad faith and offer you something that I know I will actually sell to somebody else, and then carry you around with this promise that will actually never be fulfilled, and then make you incur costs in this manner, whereas I already know that this is all pointless because I will really sell this to somebody else. These forms of misbehavior do create some forms of liability. That is that's a legal term, so some sort of, let's say, um, that's not technical word, let's say some sort of guilt that the law needs to compensate. And this is actually quite important because here you will notice that in that scenario there was no contract because there was ultimately no meeting of the minds. The offer and the acceptance did not join, they did not click, but nonetheless some form of responsibility, some form of compensation does arise. Offer and acceptance, also interesting to note, they can be explicit or implicit. So if I say you want this iPhone for 500 euros and you say yes, that's very explicit, but it can also be some sort of implicit behavior. I can sit on my desk, and the desk has a sign that says, you want an apple, just put 50 cents here and then you can take it. I just sit there, you come, you put the 50 cents and take an apple. Now, that there was offer and acceptance even though no words were exchanged. And the final thing I want you to note about offer and acceptance is that the minds actually have to meet. That is, there must be some actual, this meeting of the minds metaphor means that we must have a sufficiently, imagine a sufficiently similar idea of what's going on for there to truly be offer and acceptance. Imagine we have this person with a bubble on top of it, this sort of caricature with a bubble on top of his head, and that bubble has an image, then the other person that's shaking his hands must also have this bubble on top of his head, but pretty much the same image. They cannot, I cannot, there's problems with me saying, okay, here's, you want to buy this iPhone, and you say, yes, of course, but in your mind, what you're buying is, that's old technology, but let's say in your mind what you're buying is a cassette player. That's a little bit crazy, old stupid example. Give you an idea, you must have some actual meeting of the minds. And offer and acceptance, this sort of agreement that they exemplify must also be sufficient. What that means is that it must be enough for you to be able to make a contract. It must not have too many loose ends, not ends that the law cannot fill in. So if I say, okay, I will sell you this iPhone, and you say yes, okay, that's it. Now, we have a problem because we have not fixed the price, and the law cannot fix the price for you. A second issue is, when is something a contract? Now, we know a contract is a binding agreement between the parties, but how do we know that some agreement between parties is supposed to be binding? If I say to my friend, hey, let's meet after class to have a beer, and he says, yes, of course. Now, we have an agreement, but we don't have a contract. That seems to be self-explanatory. But well, does that how do we know that it's not? How do we know that it's not supposed to be binding? Well, you might think that the reason is that a contract comes in a piece of paper that says on the top contract, and then says I will pay you X amount and you will allow me to live in this house for a certain amount of time. Well, but you see, not all contracts have to be in writing. If you think about it, that better be the case, because there are so many things in life where law needs to give you protection, the protection of contract law, and there's no reasonable time or expectation for you to come up with a written piece of document. Even worse, we have to hire lawyers to draft the contract for you, because contract drafting can be quite technical and it can be quite a bit of an art. So think, for example, that you go to the supermarket and you buy some chicken, so that will better be a contract, because it's through contract law. At first, there's other systems, but let's say at the very basic level, it's through contract law that you're protected, that the article you buy has certain characteristics, for example, not having any material defect and not having any legal defect. So there's so many interactions in life where we cannot put things in writing and say, hey, this is a contract. And it's not only about this day-to-day stuff. It's also about things at even a business level. So if you have idea of how businessmen live their lives, if there's let's say there's a container in the middle of the ocean with some motorbikes, and I just call another one and say, hey, I have a container with motorbikes. Do you want it for 500,000? Do you want it for, that's too low, for 5 million? Yes, no, that must be done on the spot, on the phone. It might not be possible for you to say, hey, wait, let me call my lawyers, because then the opportunity might pass. So contracts cannot be in writing all the time. Even in this era where we have automated systems, that's not possible. And that raises the question of when an agreement is supposed to be a contract and when it's not. And what's quite important here is that the law has developed a series of tests enabled to assess whether some agreement is or is not a contract. Now, you can find these tests in the book, but I like to give my students some sort of summary of them because they all ultimately boil down to the same thing. They are I call them serious business test or serious business heuristic. So when the law sees some interaction and that interaction is silent, so it's not explicit about whether that interaction aims to be a contract or not, the law will ask this question: is this interaction serious business? And then if this interaction is serious business, if a lot depends on it, the law will say, okay, here we have a contract. Implicitly we have a contract. And if not, the law will say we don't. And of course, this serious business. So here you might also see a little bit, let's call it a little bit like the ideology or the mindset of private law and contract law, typically revolves around economic considerations. So if I tell my friend, hey, let's meet for a beer after class, and turns out that for some reason I am psychologically feeling terrible if my friend doesn't show up, okay, that will still not be serious business for the law. But on the other hand, if I tell my friend, hey, I'm going to make a party, a fundraising party tomorrow, and I need this sophisticated stereo equipment that you have. And if you know, can you borrow it to me? Sure, I will borrow it to you, because you know, if I don't, I will not be able to raise enough funds. I might then my whole enterprise will not get off the ground. Sure, I will borrow it to you. You know, because if you don't borrow it to me, I'll just go rent one from the store. No, I will borrow it to you. Okay, you see, in that interaction, on the other hand, the law might find a contract because there's something economical hanging on getting things right, and that would be, let's say, the success of the fundraiser and the ability to be able to fund whatever you want to fund out of it. So that is called the serious business test. Now the book gives you some examples of that, and also some situations where the law assumes that there's no serious business, for example, agreements within the family unit, and you can go read those, but to keep them in your mind, to remind of them, think of this as, let's say, serious business test, and do note that the law has this sort of economic bias for us understanding what is a serious business. For the most part, the law of contract is very economic oriented, especially in the common law. There are some exceptions to this, but we cannot go into that right now. Let's go to the sources of contract law. You will have a very detailed explanation of the idea of sources. So sources, one, let's say, less detailed, but more easy way to put it is, where does the law in this area come from? And the book mentions a variety of sources. It classifies them by their origin, let's say national law and also European law, but also classifies them according to their stringency. And I don't think I need to explain the former. I will only explain the latter. And this one is very interesting because its field of contract law is rich in giving you the sources of different stringency. And then you will notice that contract law has, I will focus on two levels of stringency. Contract law has mandatory rules and contract law has default rules. So default rules are rules that the parties can change. And mandatory rules are rules that the parties cannot change. And then, of course, I always give my students this image of default versus mandatory, which is, in my point of view, very explanatory exactly for the field of contract law. Let's say you go to Burger King or McDonald's, might not be your cup of tea, probably it's not mine either, but that's a good place to think about this. Let's say you stand in line and then you say, what do you want? I want a Whopper. Okay, you'll get something. You get specifically a hamburger with lettuce, meat, I'm not sure what else it has, cheese, tomatoes, and that's what you'll get. You don't need to say, I want bread, I want cheese, I want onions, I want tomatoes. You don't need to say that. You just simply say Whopper and you know what you'll get. On the other hand, you could also go to them and say, okay, no, make it my way. And say, I don't want lettuce, I don't want cheese, I don't want meat, I just want the bread. They'll probably do that for you. And that's the difference between that's exactly what a default rule is in this context. Contract law, you say, if you say something like, you want to buy this iPhone for 500 euros, and you say yes, there's many things that you have not said. For example, where will the iPhone be delivered? What happens in case the iPhone doesn't work? These things you have not defined. But happily, you don't need to, because those are defaults. The contract law, for example, in the Netherlands, the civil code will provide the defaults. It will say, for example, if you sell a defective product, you need to give the money back or so forth. So you don't have that problem. The defaults are filled in the same way that in saying Whopper, the ingredients of the hamburger are filled in. A mandatory rule, on the other hand, is a rule that you cannot change. A rule where the law is not a default, but it's something that has to be there. And then, yeah, this one's a little bit more difficult to explain in the context of the fast food example, but to give you an idea, this one's pretty silly, but you say you go to the fast food shop and then you say, okay, well, now I want this hamburger, but with shrimp on it. I'm sorry, we don't have that. We don't do that. Probably they do, but let's just make they don't. Okay, and in any case, and then more realistically, right? You say, okay, now here's my contract. I customize it however I want. And what I actually want is that you give me 500 grams of cocaine. Well, that's not going to happen. That's not something that the law will authorize, because a default rule is that certain things cannot be contracted. And that can be things that are essentially criminal. For example, trafficking in hard drugs or hiring somebody to kill somebody. That sort of thing would be would not be a scenario that the law will allow. So you can think of the sources of contract law in regards to their stringency as involving default rules and mandatory rules. Default rules are there for your convenience, so that you don't have to wait so long. in the line in the McDonald's, or that you don't have to wait so long drafting a contract saying exactly where the thing will be delivered, what will happen if you don't do it, and so forth. And the mandatory rules, by contrast, they're to set limits, not to allow you to do absolutely anything, but to give you a limit on what you're allowed to do. Uh, so that is a little bit how things operate here. And then it's some rules are there for convenience and they're overridable, and other rules are not. They set the limits for where the parties have freedom to contract, limits that they have to respect. And then why would you ever change the default rules? Of course, there will be scenarios where it's pretty obvious. It's just a matter of convenience. Hey, don't deliver the iPhone in my home. I will go pick it up because I will go there tomorrow. And then, of course, there will be situations where you don't want to take defaults because what you're contracting is so special and so specific that you want to get things 100% right. And then let's say you're not just buying an iPhone, you're buying an airplane turbine. So if you're buying an airplane turbine, you're going to both need a lawyer and you're going to need a lot of expertise over airplane turbines, because you need to know exactly how those things are likely to, for example, how those things are likely to malfunction and what sort of care needs to be given in its delivery. That is a very technical thing where you better be absolutely precise about how this contract is being written. Now we will touch upon the issue of contract validity. Uh, Contract validity is a question that, if we were being 100% logical, it would not be different from, is this a contract, yes or no? But for reasons of practicality, the law organizes the discussion of, is this a contract, into two parts. Well, one of them is that, do we actually have enough offer and acceptance, agreement, meeting of the minds, intention to be bound to configure a contract? And the other part is there something, assuming we have this, is there something wrong with it? Is there something wrong with it in such a manner that we will say, well, this agreement that purports to be binding nonetheless is not good, is somehow counterfeit, and does not deserve legal enforcement. Now, you will read much more detail about this in the book, but to give you guidance and a little bit more abstraction to what you're reading, let me just give you what would be, let's say, a handle on this topic. We can divide contract validity into two big parts: procedural validity and substantive validity. The first one is more important and nobody disagrees with it. The second one is a little bit polemical, but it's also very interesting. Now, procedural validity, why is it called procedural? Think about it. That's a little bit tricky, because the law typically is very wise in its choice of words, but that wisdom might not be immediately transparent. So procedural validity, we mean we object to this contract not because of what it says, but because something happens in the process of getting to that contract that makes its contents not good, not acceptable, that makes its existence not acceptable. And then let's say I say, okay, you're getting this iPhone for 300 euros. This is a very fair price. So, yeah, and it's an excellent iPhone. It's a fantastic product. By the way, I don't have an iPhone, so I never had one. So I'm not really, it's just very convenient example. I think the book uses the same one. But you know, to get to that, I put a gun to your head. So you better take this iPhone at 300 euros because you have to, because I am some sort of very forceful marketing for Apple. Yeah, even if the product is excellent, even if the price is fair, the law will still say, I cannot accept that. There's something going wrong at the level of the procedure that makes this contract unacceptable. Getting to your consent, getting to the agreement, getting to yes, has been invalidated because a practice that occurred makes that invalid. And in this case, the practice is threat or force, this menacing the person to shoot him if it doesn't sign. There's other forms, and you can read about them in the book. There's other things that will in law, at least let's say in the civil law jurisdiction, we'll say vitiate consent, the vices of consent, things that will make this agreement somehow invalid. I'm giving you a lot of words, but they all boil down to the same thing. So let's just give different expressions for the same content that sometimes help. And then substantive invalidity is that doesn't have to do with your consent. It does not have to do with the procedure of getting to the contract, but with the contents of the contract. I said this one's polemical. Okay, let me split that claim in half. There's a part of it which is not polemical and one that is. What's not polemical is what we already said, that is some things you just cannot contract. And then buying 500 grams of cocaine, or in most places hiring somebody to be a mother of your child, and then you just give the child as soon as the child is born. These things the problem is not the consent, the problem is the substance. The law simply does not allow this, because the law is putting a moral limit on the sort of things that you can do. And then it's not about your consent. You say, oh, but I definitively consent to get to buy this drug and to all the consequences thereafter, and you definitively consent to sell it to me. Okay, that doesn't matter. The law does not allow that. The law does not want to allow that. It has nothing to do with your state of mind, but with the sort of thing you want to carry out. And the other part that's polemical has to do with the concept of latio enormis. The concept of latio enormis is in the book, but it's gone through very, very quickly. But it's a concept that I find extremely interesting, and it has. So normally I give a little bit explanation about it. So latio enormis essentially says, okay, but what happens if we have a contract, and essentially I'm getting ripped off? I'm buying this iPhone for 5,000 euros, whereas in the market it's only worth 500. Or I am selling you this Monet painting for 20 cents when it's actually worth millions. So that's the so-called latio enormis. And here the problem is the substance. The idea is, by definition, that or ex hypothesis, the idea is that there is consent, there is agreement. Sure, you want to sell the Monet for 20 cents? Yes, sure. But it can be worth more. No, I want to sell it for 20 cents. Okay, so ex hypothesis, there is clear-minded consent here, but will the law allow you to get ripped off in this manner? And of course, you can notice that you might see why this is polemical. Hey, if you want to get ripped off, then why not? That's your choice. Let's say that's the more liberal approach. The more conservative or paternalistic approach might say, well, we can still not allow that. And I led you to think why. Then actually the more superficial reason is paternalism, but there is a deeper reason that I want you to think about it. Why would you not allow some people to do stuff like that? And I will give you an example that might get you thinking in the right direction. So let's say that I sell this Monet for 20 cents to a judge. Or I sell this Monet for 20 cents to a candidate for presidency. Now, there's something that's not right about that, and it's not just paternalism. Okay, so that wraps things up for now. I think with this, you should be able to continue reading the chapter, to complete it, and to be able to get a good grip of the topics that we have not covered. We will discuss things in class, and we will have other forms, other mediums of communication to make sure we fully grasp them if they are somehow difficult. Have a good week.